given how important CO2 is to the economy, if you're a food manufacturer, meat processor, you don't have CO2, you have to shut down your facility, completely clean it out, and start it up again. So we see that over time, as new tax policies are coming out and as the supply-demand imbalance is going to grow, more and more market demand for an on-site supply of CO2.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Base Carbon. It's time to get serious on carbon. Learn more at basecarbon.com.
Welcome back to Carbon Frontiers 2024 on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abex Technologies. Our guest today is Matt Atwood, founder and CEO at Aircapture. We'll be discussing how they're developing their direct air capture technology into an effective, scalable solution by commercializing atmospheric CO2. Hello, Matt. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Thank you so much, Dave. Big fan of the podcast. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I've been really looking forward to this conversation with you about the work that you're doing at Aircapture, in particular because I think you have a very unique business model and approach to the ever-important part of scaling air capture technology. And we talk a lot on this podcast about the importance of putting a price on carbon in terms of a carbon tax or a price for carbon offsets. But your approach was different. It was to find a market where there was already a price for CO2 and customers willing to pay for the CO2 that you capture. That is, rather than relying solely on receiving government grants or selling carbon offsets, you sell the CO2 that you capture for industrial uses. Carbonated beverages, dry ice, greenhouses, concrete, as well as people can store it, with geologic sequestration. And I wanted to ask you, how did you think of that business model and why did you choose it?
That's a great question. Been working in and around the renewable energy industry for over 20 years. And I've been really focused on direct air capture technologies for over 10 years. And as I was thinking about the technology maturity and the market application, it was very clear that globally we need to reduce atmospheric CO2, and carbon dioxide removal is on the critical path for a number of reasons regarding climate change and utilization of carbon in various markets. But it was just a couple years ago when I realized that the right market approach for this technology early on is to first address the existing mature markets of CO2, and that CO2 is very much a critical commodity in many applications. The world's economy basically runs on carbon. It's in the food we eat, it's in the fuels we use, it's in the batteries that are in our phones and electric cars, it's in plastics, refrigeration, and the cold chain. The economy is very much driven by CO2 utilization in many, many ways. And there's a very mature merchant market for CO2. The merchant market for CO2, one way to think about it is, any company that purchases CO2 that's delivered on a truck. The CO2 comes in and they put it in a tank, and then they use that to carbonate their beverages, beer, packaged food. The use cases are wide and varied. And this is required globally. And what sort of dawned on me a couple of years ago was that we could apply this technology to the on-site business. We call it CO2 as a service. So in the mature merchant market, customers are currently buying CO2, it's delivered on a truck, and we sell them the CO2 with our machines on-site at their facility on a long-term contract basis. And our technology is unique in that we can take a modular approach that specifically lends itself for the on-site business. And it's a differentiated product, and we can provide better pricing to our customers, higher reliability, address supply chain disruptions. There's a number of things that are interesting with this approach.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a question about pricing. 'Cause on the one hand, carbon loose in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide is problematic. On the other hand, there's been quite a few articles in recent years on shortages of CO2 for beverage companies due to the effects of the pandemic, in particular on ethanol and ammonia fertilizer producers, amongst others. I'm curious, what sort of price do you receive for your CO2, and how does it compare to pricing in carbon markets?
That's a great question. The pricing of CO2 in the merchant market varies widely. The predominant factor of this is logistics. The CO2 supplies are typically fertilizer plants, ethanol plants, oil and gas plants. And that CO2 is captured and delivered on trucks, sometimes very long distances, or rail cars, or ISO containers on ships. The pricing to the end customer is very much related to the logistics cost of that supply chain. So logistics is a huge factor, but it also impacts reliability and purity of supply. So we have customers today, if you're close to a CO2 supply, you may only be paying a couple $100 per ton for high-grade CO2. We also have customers that are paying several thousands of dollars per ton for the same CO2 supply. And the carbon market pricing is very kind of opaque, and the long-term price trends are unknown. So by being able to apply our technology to a mature market with customers that are paying a high price for CO2 today, we can drive our costs down over time. We don't need to rely on carbon markets or tax credits to be profitable with our technology in the near term. And there's a growing supply-demand imbalance in the CO2 merchant market currently today. The demand for CO2 is growing between 3 to 5% globally. However, the supply is coming offline around 1 to 2%. So even today, there's this growing imbalance in the market, which is driving costs up. We have customers that are unable to get their CO2, that are being force majeured out of contracts. And this is because there are refineries that are being curtailed and shut down, and there's not more CO2 supply coming online. Yet the market is growing. There are more craft beer operators that are coming online, and there's more technologies that are requiring CO2 to convert into other products. And we don't see this changing. CO2 is very much a critical commodity for the food industry, for the beverage industry, for refrigeration. And in the US, we now have situations where a large percentage of the CO2 supply comes from ethanol plants, about 30% of the CO2 supply in North America. Many of these ethanol plants are filing permits to pump CO2 into the ground, and under the 45Q of the tax code will be paid $130 a ton for that CO2, whereas now they're maybe only making $5 or $10 a ton to sell that CO2. So given how important CO2 is to the economy, if you're a food manufacturer, meat processor, you don't have CO2, you have to shut down your facility, completely clean it out, and start it up again. So we see that over time, as new tax policies are coming out and as the supply-demand imbalance is going to grow, more and more market demand for an on-site supply of CO2. And on-site industrial gases is a great business. If you are a hospital and there's an oxygen plant in the back, you don't typically own the oxygen plant. An industrial gas company owns that oxygen plant, and you buy the oxygen. And this, what we are doing, is the first time that on-site CO2 is available to customers. And we think that this approach and applying this approach to the merchant market is going to become more and more important over time, while there's a continuing upward price pressure on CO2.
Yeah, that idea that as government policy starts paying those who produce the CO2 now to just pump it underground, it's going to make an even tighter squeeze on those who need to use it.
And not to mention the need for industrial decarbonization. We can address both the Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions with our technology on site while providing a higher purity, more reliable, and lower cost supply. So it's a good synergy between our technology and the market demand, and we see that synergy growing over time.
And I wanted to ask you about some of the other suppliers in the CO2 market, because selling the captured carbon to industrial users seems to make good business sense for the reasons we've been talking about. But I'm curious, for the skeptic who might say, does it make sense for the overall environment? Like, what does it add to overall CO2 reduction efforts if the users ultimately release that CO2 back into the atmosphere? Like, I'm trying, like, is your way of providing the CO2 displacing other non-captured sources of CO2 that would be kind of net emissions into the atmosphere?
Yes, in many cases it does. The existing supply chain of CO2 is in many cases very carbon intensive, and it really varies on what that supply of CO2 is. Some CO2 supply comes from CO2 wells underground, and the cost of the logistics of moving that CO2 around is not just in the delivered price of CO2 to the customer, but it's also in the carbon intensity of that CO2 supply to the end customer. In many cases, the carbon intensity of that CO2 supply, it nets out to being over 2 tons of CO2 is emitted in the full kind of life cycle of that supply for every one that's consumed. So if we compare an on-site business of CO2 for the merchant market to something like sequestration, where the incumbent supply of CO2 has a high carbon intensity, it actually makes more sense from an overall atmospheric carbon reduction standpoint to first decarbonize those high intensity existing supply chains of CO2. Because if you pull 1 ton of CO2 out of the air and stick it in the ground, and it processes about 90% efficient, you're pulling out about 0.9 tons of CO2 for every one you capture. However, you're displacing an incumbent supply of CO2 that has over a 2-to-1 carbon intensity. Your net carbon impact is larger by displacing that incumbent supply than it is by sequestering the CO2 directly, even if that CO2 ends up going into a soda can and is quickly released back into the atmosphere.
It's pretty impressive that it's 2-to-1 just in the logistics of moving it around. It kind of shows you in commodities so much is logistics and moving things from one place to another. Another thing that often comes up that I wanted to talk with you about, particularly when people talk about direct air capture and technological ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere, is the question of scale. Like, hey, it works at a small scale, but how are we going to scale it to a big enough level that it can make a meaningful difference in overall reduction efforts? And this seems to be your focus as well. And you seem to be very focused on basically being able to drive down the cost of air capture by taking advantage of, Wright's law, similar to Moore's law, which states that the number of transistors on integrated circuits double every 2 years. Wright's law was the observation that doubling cumulative production drives down costs by a fixed percentage. I think people are familiar with this from solar power, where, for about every time you double installed solar power, drives the price down by 20%. So 20 years ago, solar was very expensive. Now it's very cheap. And I'm curious, how does your business model help you scale more quickly? And why is that such a big focus for your business?
I'm so glad you asked me that question. I often tell my team every decision we make is to solve for scale. The way we view it is there's a good synergy between the on-site business, the merchant market, our CO2 as a service business, and where we need to get to over time for larger scale atmospheric CO2 removal. We develop a modular approach to direct air capture. So we believe direct air capture is actually cheaper if you build a larger number of smaller machines than a smaller number of large machines. And that's a unique way to think about the problem. Most people, when you think about large-scale industrial processes like oil and gas, the opposite is actually true. As you build a larger capital plant, your unit cost to produce your finished product goes down. But the same does not hold true for direct air capture. There are locations in terms of scale of a plant size where the technology becomes more efficient and your finished cost of CO2 capture becomes lower. So by working with and focusing on a learning by doing model, what we do is we can deploy a smaller amount of capital on a shorter time frame into a larger number of plants and machine designs while deploying them into our customers' locations, even at a smaller scale, and we can focus on driving down the learning curve while generating good revenues. And as we double technology capacity, we drive the costs down each time. So compared to many other approaches in the direct air capture industry, where the technology requires a very large capital plant to make any economic sense. Our approach is unique in that we have developed smaller scale modular technologies together with the ancillary technologies that are required to bring the CO2 to market. I often say to folks, it's one thing to pull CO2 out of the air, but so what? Who cares? The market doesn't need gaseous CO2 in most applications. It needs high-grade liquid CO2 for beverage applications or food applications or refrigeration applications. It needs supercritical CO2 for sequestration applications. And what we do is we take a systems approach to combine both our direct air capture technologies with the other downstream technologies, build a high efficiency system, and deliver that CO2 to market. And by being able to do this with a larger number of smaller installations, we can drive our costs down more efficiently over time.
And when you look at those cost reduction that you may have seen so far, like, are you already seeing that? Are you already seeing cost reduction benefits from learning by doing? Are there certain things, I don't want you to give away the secret sauce or anything, but are there kind of like interesting insights and interesting things you've come across already at Aircapture?
Oh, certainly. Our learning rates, we evaluate them both on the sort of capital side. So what is the capital cost of the capital plant, as well as on the energy consumption side. At present, our CapEx learning rates are very high. We have seen over a 50% reduction in cost in the last 12 months in our capital plant. And so this drives up capital efficiency and helps to drive highly capital efficient machines. In addition, on the energy consumption side, as we build more machines and we iterate and do value engineering, we can continue to make our process more efficient and less energy intensive by developing more efficient designs and iterating on that design into our customers' facilities. So compared again with other technology approaches that require much larger capital plans, that learning curve requires more time, more money, and is harder to drive down at the speed and scale that we think is required to address this market and try to solve for climate change. So we project our learning rates will settle around 20 to 25% over time, but at present they're much higher.
And for those of us who need to learn a little bit more about this and try to understand this technology and where the difficulties, where the obstacles might lie, could you give us like the 101 course in how these machines operate?
Oh, certainly. So the first rule in direct air capture seems obvious, but it's move a lot of air. So the capture of CO2 is defined basically by the surface area of whatever you're going to use to contact the CO2 and the volume of that capture medium. So one needs to design a capital plant that configures typically a fan to move air. There are passive technologies to direct air capture, but they're very low capital efficiency. But CO2 is very dilute in the air. It's 0.04%. And you need to move about 3,000 tons of air to capture 1 ton of CO2. So the trick is to design a highly capital efficient machine that can move large quantities of air through a capture medium with the lowest possible energy cost to capture the CO2, and then an efficient design to release the CO2 and then purify it and bring it to market. So the technology approach requires a number of different systems working together to build a finished product. If it's high-grade liquid CO2, you need an efficient direct air capture machine that moves a lot of air, that can, with as low energy cost and as low carbon intensity in that energy process as possible, capture and release that CO2, then purify that CO2 and stick it in a tank so that the customer can buy it.
And I think you're a chemist by background, right?
Correct.
I'm curious, like, if you look at that process, where do you see the potential biggest gains, or maybe what's the limiting factor on the physical side of, is it the ability to move lots of air economically over the contact material? Is it something about the chemistry of the material itself that it can absorb and release CO2 more readily? Or is it, what do you do with it once you've got it captured?
Well, I think the honest answer, it's all of the above. But where I think the technology really has the opportunity to become much more efficient comes down to kinetics. So within the contactor, how you're capturing the CO2, as you move the CO2 through the contactor, you want to try to capture as much of that CO2 that you can so that you move less air. And the limiting factor of the technology fundamentally comes down to the kinetics of capture. So you want to design a process that you can capture as much CO2 with the lowest amount of energy cost, we call pressure drop in the system, and then release that CO2 with, again, a lower energy cost system. In our system, we can use waste heat or we can generate the heat if needed, and then convert that CO2 into a saleable product. And the energy cost of that process, the energy efficiency of that process, and the overall capital efficiency of that plant are fundamentally the denominator of all the economics. And it's the integration of these approaches and building an efficient machine design that enables one to capture CO2 effectively and efficiently and bring it to market at a price point that can compete with incumbent CO2 supply.
And I think you said earlier, you ultimately see like the improvements you can make in these machines, 20, 25% a year over time. So kind of comparable to what people saw in solar, plus or minus. I'm curious, do you think air capture costs can ultimately be driven down the way we've seen solar costs driven down? How far do you think you can push that given enough time and enough effort?
At the long tail of technical maturity of direct air capture, I believe it's entirely feasible to operate direct air capture together with the technologies required to bring it to market at under $50 a ton in today's dollars. And there's a couple of reasons why that's true. There's, from a thermodynamics perspective, the actual cost of capturing the CO2, the fan efficiencies of moving the air, all these things. There's no reason why that cost of capture can't be sort of in the $15 a ton range ultimately. Then you have capital efficiency and capital costs. So as you add up all these costs and, kind of a reasonable price of capital to deploy it all, we believe that $50 a ton is ultimately achievable. And this is also something that the U.S. National Academy of Sciences put out a report several years ago on the same kind of technology approach, back then stating that they believed that the cost of capture could be under $20 a ton ultimately. So we think that's a pretty reasonable price target over time, and we're well on the path of driving our costs down into that range.
Yeah, that would be a real game changer if you could do that at scale. I wanted to come back and ask you, you brought up a point earlier that, you've gone with like the smaller modular units deployed at the point of use. And that seems like a big contrast to other CO2 capture approaches, which often seem like it's trying to capture CO2 at the point of emission or trying to use direct air capture to capture it at the point of where you want to store it ultimately. And it sounds like from a technological standpoint, bigger isn't necessarily better. Is the bigger approach more because they kind of want to collect it and where you're putting it ultimately, say underground or sequestering it, is what causes you to want to build a big facility in one location?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why some of the technology approaches require larger scale embodiments. It can be fundamental to the technology process itself. Some direct air capture technologies require very high temperature processes to release the CO2 from their capture medium. And in these kinds of technology approaches, you have to build a big machine for it to pay off. It's similar, to building a very high temperature kind of cement clinker. You can't really do that efficiently at a very small scale. And so if you have that kind of technology approach, then it makes a lot of sense to apply the technology to sequestration and put the plant near the wellhead. Or if you're going to make synthetic fuels, where you're going to make the fuels, some technology approaches are being used for enhanced oil recovery, where they're building large capital plants to put CO2 into the ground and they're getting oil out. These types of larger scale technologies don't lend themselves to an on-site model because they just can't scale down efficiently.
I wanted to ask you, when you look at your approach, do you see a role for both types of approaches due to the variations of technology or application? Or do you think the market will gravitate towards yours?
Well, I think it's an all of the above approach. We have to do all the technology approaches in parallel. And it may be the case that some high temperature processes or larger scale embodiments will make lower cost sense over time at these larger scales. But they will take much more capital to deploy, more time to build them. And, we're taking the belief that a modular approach ultimately is on the lowest cost learning curve. And that's what we're leaning into. But you raised a question about point source capture earlier, and I wanted to address that. We should certainly be decarbonizing every point source that we can. Point sources of CO2, power plants, ethanol plants, ethylene plants, things like this, they put out a higher concentration of CO2, sometimes up to 10% CO2 concentrate, or in the case of an ethanol plant, nearly 100%. Those point source emissions of CO2 should be decarbonized, and the economics of those should be well understood. However, what most people fail to realize is in order to decarbonize those point sources, you have to be within an economically reasonable distance of doing something useful with the CO2. So there are many power plants in the world, in fact, the majority of them, where you can capture the CO2, but you can't economically bring it to market. You'd have to build a pipeline. Pipelines are expensive. You'd have to truck it. So we have to do both. We have to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. We have to decarbonize the existing point sources where we can, and we should invest in those projects where it makes economic sense. And we should deploy the technology as widely and as efficiently as we can. And getting back to the learning curve question, we should focus our investments as a society in the areas where we can really focus on learning curve rates and drive these costs down.
And, you brought up earlier in terms of driving costs down that you could foresee, one day getting it to $50 a ton for captured CO2, some studies that say you could push it even lower than that. And I'm curious, with cost levels that low, what is your long-term vision for air capture? Is it to drive down the costs and then deploy the technology primarily for sequestration? Or do you see the selling of captured CO2 as part of building a more long-term circular industry for those commercial users?
I think we need to do both. As I stated earlier, decarbonizing the existing merchant market is not only on the critical path relative to climate change and resilience, but it's going to be increasingly important for industrial customers to decarbonize their emissions. By insetting the technology on site, we provide our customers with a more reliable, higher purity and lower cost CO2 supply while simultaneously decarbonizing their operations and emissions. However, from a strategic perspective, I would say it's all part of a bigger plan. I often tell people it makes absolutely no difference how much CO2 we pull out of the atmosphere and sequester in the next 3 to 5 years. What matters is what our price is in 3 to 5 years. The infrastructure required to sequester the CO2 takes time, especially here in the US. The EPA permitting process is long, the cost of developing the pore space is quite high, and the cost of building the pipelines to that pore space is high. So the infrastructure takes time. Our strategy is to build a robust, near-term, strong revenue-generating business while driving our costs on the learning curve. And when that infrastructure is mature and ready in 3 to 5 years, Aircapture is working to be the lowest cost technology provider to the sequestration market when that time comes. However, the role of CO2 in various applications beyond sequestration is also on the critical path. We aren't going to electrify all of the logistics supply chain. The future requires us to make synthetic fuels from CO2 and hydrogen from water, as well as providing CO2 to the existing and growing merchant market that requires the CO2 supply where the supply is coming off.
And I wanted to thank you, Matt. I found this to be a really thought-provoking conversation with your unique business model, your approach to scaling air capture technology to meet that long-term vision. I guess I need to ask you, though, in terms of the obstacles, what's needed? What do you see on the critical path for you towards scaling this technology and having it more widely adopted by the market?
That's a great question. As I think about the future and I think about the scale of the technology adoption that's required to address the threat of climate change, it's very large. The IPCC has said we need at least 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal by mid-century. We agree with that number. We think it might even be a little low due to the more recent climate science that's come out. That's an optimistic scenario. However, most people don't think about is what does it take to get there? And as you think about how technology curves mature and adopt, there are these logistics function curves where you have a kind of a slow adoption of technology early on, then a rapid adoption phase and a tail off phase. You see this in basically every kind of commercial technology, whether it's radios, televisions, or refrigeration, or automobiles, or airplanes. And as we think about the technology adoption curves that are required to meet this target of 10 gigatons of removal by mid-century, we need to be able to develop a manufacturing supply chain of direct air capture and other carbon dioxide removal technologies that exceeds about 1.7 billion tons of capacity coming online every year, year over year, by around 2045, maybe a little sooner. As you think about the scale of that problem, it is nearly twice the World War II mobilization rate from an industrial perspective, from today to mid-century. And as we develop the technology and we drive our costs down, that's one part of the equation. Of course, we need the infrastructure to sequester the CO2 or turn the CO2 into fuels. That's another part of the equation. But in our opinion, a critical component to making this all work in time and at the scale we need is that these technologies have to be financeable. And they have to be financeable by banks and by traditional project finance and infrastructure funds that want to invest in this technology, see the need for it, see the market size of it. But it's difficult relative to some of these applications, how to think about financing these technologies. If we think about the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets, you need, in order to project finance these technologies, you need a long-term offtake agreement with a creditworthy counterparty, 10 years, possibly longer, to finance these projects. And it's very difficult to envision what the price of the technology is going to be on a cost in 10 years, and especially in the voluntary carbon market, what that price might be, and how do you solve that problem early on? How do you go to a corporate and say, we would like you to commit to a price per ton of CO2 in 10 years because we want to have a bank finance this technology. We may be able to get insurance companies to come in and provide technology performance guarantees, the kinds of insurances that are required to scale up these technologies. But there's a big missing component relative to how these technologies are financed at scale. And so I see very much what's on the critical path of getting these technologies to scale at timeframes that we need them to be there to address the threat of climate change as being fundamentally kind of on the project finance question. And what we believe and what we're working on is to focus on the learning curve, get to scale, ensure that our manufacturing capabilities are at scale when the technology maturity is there in several years, and work on having many demonstrations of the technology in many different market conditions and environmental conditions that we can provide some level of comfort and guarantee to the technology investors at the project level to be able to get to scale. And I very much see that on the critical path. And I think it's a pretty difficult question to answer, but we have to get there from here, and we have to figure out how to do that. And we have to build relationships with off-takers in the voluntary carbon market, with customers that want to convert the CO2 into some other useful product, and with banks and governments that want to help to figure out how to backstop these technologies and finance them.
Thanks again to Matt Atwood, founder and CEO at Aircapture. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Carbon Frontiers 2024. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is presented by Base Carbon, a financier of projects involved primarily in the global voluntary carbon markets. Base Carbon endeavors to be the preferred carbon project partner in providing capital and management resources to carbon removal and abatement projects globally, and where appropriate, will utilize technologies within the evolving environmental industries to enhance efficiencies, commercial credibility, and trading transparency. For more information, visit basecarbon.com. Base Carbon, sensible carbon investing. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.